Hello and welcome to Conversations. I'm joined by my good pal James.
Hello.
Um, James, there's a question that's been on my mind for a long time, and that is, what is your favorite dictator of all time?
I don't know. Often with like favorite dictators, I actually like the person who whispers in their ear more.
Oh
Like
yeah, for sure.
so like the number two. I really like Che Guevara. He's very charismatic, very passionate, guerrilla war leader. And then I also really like Jiang Qing, who is Mao Zedong's wife. Um,
Mm.
and she was convinced the world was out to get her. So she completely reorganized state art and stuff like that to basically glorify communism and also cut off because she was a failed actress. So she basically then also ruined other actresses who she felt had like stolen her opportunity. She ruined their careers as her point of place of power.
That's so
So
mad.
I think Jiang King is like up there for me. I think although she is not a dictator, she was very important in the realm of dictators.
Who's that woman? You just like sparked a neuron in my brain. Who's that woman from North Korea? Is she like Kim Jong-un's sister or something? Everyone was really
Oh,
scared of her.
I can't. I remember vaguely who you're talking about.
I
Not
think it's
not 100.
Kim Yo Jong.
Yeah,
Maybe.
she kind of wears the
Yeah,
trousers in her career.
yeah, yeah. She was like apparently like everyone's more scared of her or something.
She's
Um,
the ruler of North Korea.
yeah, she's just scary to look at. Like she's got that scary face, the way she looks. Um, I asked this question. I actually couldn't think of one. There's so many good examples. Uh, I I do like the classics, like Stalin, all those guys. Pretty cool, pretty interesting. Um, you know, a lot of the Soviet leaders were really interesting. This is probably getting ahead of myself too much, but
Yeah,
I do find them very interesting because they all had very different like ways of going about it. Obviously, Stalin was like the very like classic. Well, he's basically a psychopath, obviously.
yeah.
And then you had Khrushchev, which was sort of this strange middle ground where he was obviously very dedicated to the regime, but he tried. I don't know. It's very hard to tell whether he really wanted to, but he seemed to try and like have some sort of relationship with the West, and the U.S.
Yeah.
specifically. Him and JFK apparently got on quite well. And there was good old Gorby. Um, but uh, there's some good candidates in there for sure. And speaking of the Soviet Union, I guess today we are discussing communism, specifically, I guess, in the modern sphere, because I guess people, it's not really a factor of our lives anymore, like it was in the 20th century so much. There's no, it's not really in the back of everyone's heads that they might be invaded by a communist country, although it could still happen. But I guess for those of you who don't know what communism is or where it came from, the very, very simple, brief history lesson is that the Russians had a revolution, which eventually basically led to them becoming what's now known as a communist country.
Born on the
Essentially,
ideals. Interjection. Born on the ideals of Karl Marx, the
yeah,
rebel.
no, yeah, I should clarify. It's not, they didn't start off with these ideals. It was more of a socialist revolution. It was basically just as an anti-Tsarist movement because there was very strong classism and lots of poverty in Russia. And the basic original idea was just that they wanted to eat bread. They wanted to not starve.
Mm.
Um, and over the years, it obviously sort of morphed into this idea uh, that the state basically controls everything, and you work jobs not for the wages you earn, but for for the good of your society and for the good of the state, I guess you'd say. That's I guess that's sort of the main gist of it. It's pretty much the opposite of like capitalism. Obviously, it's pretty much the opposite of individualism and profit seeking. There's a lot more emphasis on what you're doing for society rather than what you're doing for yourself. And if someone has too much money, even if they earned it for whatever means, then it's that should be diverged. That should be given to other people, and you shouldn't hoard it all for yourself. It's basically the general idea, I suppose.
Protect the many, not the few, and not those who have opportunities, who've had more opportunities. Capitalism traditionally is viewed to support, but also in capitalism, if you are ambitious and you have a drive to succeed, the model is no matter your background, you can succeed.
Yes.
So these opposing ideologies, as Ed said, caused the Cold War, which started off in the 50s, the late 40s, about 49, I believe, the Cold War started.
Well, there was sort of brimmings of it before World War II. Obviously, we were allies with Russia. They helped us defeat Nazi Germany. But we were, I mean, there's definitely evidence that the US and the Soviet Union were sort of aware of this sort of rising potential conflict after the Second World War. It was part of the reason why the United Nations were, so they sort of why the US decided to put so much emphasis on this idea, because obviously they were worried about another world war, and they wanted to try in any way they could to prevent this, which obviously led to decades upon decades of friction between the US and the USSR. There was many times where it came pretty close to World War III. This is a side note, but it really bothered me the way they taught this stuff in history, because they would pretty much pitch it as, well, it was the war that never got hot. And you hear that and you think, well, that's fucking boring, isn't it? But there's so much interesting stuff. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I suppose most people are familiar with. That shit is like really interesting, because it came very close.
The Korean War, the Vietnam War. Those are like some major incidents in the Cold War. Then there's also the Berlin airstrike in 1949 to 1951. I believe, I can't quite remember. But there are definitely moments of complete crisis within this that are which continue throughout the period up until 1991, when the Berlin Wall fell. But what I'm kind of interested in is I really like I have quite a lot of empathy with the Cuban Revolution. So because capitalism, because we saw communism traditionally as a scourge of the earth. They were going to dominate and take over the world and through revolution. But capitalism is also guilty of this to serve its own interests. In Cuba, with the revolution led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, overthrew Batista, who was a Cuban dictator who had been imposed by the American government.
By the US, yeah.
By the US. So and they had a mass uprising, and they stormed Havana, and they were successful, and Cuba has been a communist nation ever since 1959. So
it's really emphasized there, like Batista was pretty, as like a month. I mean, as the name suggests, he was a real monster. Like it really just goes to show that, like, the US didn't know what it was doing. And
I mean,
everyone, conversely, for the most part, pretty much everyone liked Fidel Castro.
There was mass corruption with Batista. A lot of people, there was a lot of poverty. Meanwhile, he was obviously serving himself quite well, and that of his cronies. So what the Fidel's message of communism was massively appealing because it was all about distributing the wealth and education. But what America goes and does is it then imposes economic sanctions on this country, and in North Korea, the UN also it's also sanctioned under the UN, which leads to these countries working out how to maintain a trade and how to maintain, imports and exports which they need to survive, such as oil or food or medicine or even like educational routes, to keep their society afloat. And so during the period of the Cold War, both these countries could access the USSR and China as means to get what they need. However, at the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Chinese communist system, they have become very isolated, and they are on opposing ends of the world. With Cuba being in the Caribbean and North Korea being on an Asian peninsula. So it's that they have very different. It's not like they can really buddy up particularly.
Yeah, originally go on.
Even though their internal societies appear to be somewhat different in some ways, at the moment, North Korea is still massively militarized and massively tries to show off militaristic strength. And Cuba did do this throughout the 20th century. It would like send off troops to Algeria and to the Congo and to Namibia and Bolivia and Ecuador to liberate countries from oppressive fascist regimes. But more recently, they have taken a more diplomatic approach. So should we not support this diplomatic approach? Is my query. Anyway.
Yeah.
What you were saying?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, it's the reason, I guess, why we still talk about Cuba, or why we did at the time. They were obviously strategically, they were in a very good position for the USSR, which is essentially what caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, like we mentioned, the overthrowing of Batista and the Cuban Revolution, the USSR was eager to, in any way it could, sort of, well, in the East, it was trying to expand its buffer zone, basically create a wall of states, and they did that mostly through annexation. But with Cuba, they tried to seek an ally in Cuba, pretty much because, well, obviously they're a communist nation, but they could essentially have missiles there in range of the.
It's less than 100 miles to Florida from Cuba, which is why it's very important to have an outpost there.
So obviously that meant that they had a vested interest, and like you said, they provided them with lots of benefits. Now, after the USSR, I guess we should clarify that the USSR, as it was called then, I guess you'd call it, is no longer, doesn't exist. It's just Russia now, because the USSR was more of like as I said, the multiple states that they annexed and sort of claimed as the Soviet Union. But anyway, yeah, now there's no longer that vested interest, I suppose. There's no longer that one-sided sort of supplying of resources and everything. So Cuba has become a bit more of its own identity. And I think, like you said, like you touched on it, it's done so mostly in positive ways. It's a big tourist destination, but as a society, I think it's a lot more. I don't know. In a way, it's kind of hopeful to what a communist country or communist. I wouldn't really. it's difficult to say because obviously to say communist, it's very like as if there's a cut and dry thing, but realistically there's no such thing as like, you know, communist straight cut and, you know, black and white communism basically. And yeah, go on.
Well, levels of education are very good in Cuba, for example, and so is healthcare. They've got very, very good healthcare. They've got very good levels of education. So there is opportunity. There isn't a deprivation of healthcare, or and they aren't, and the people of Cuba are not inhibited to basically, if they want to become a teacher, or they want to become a doctor, or they want to become a lawyer, they're not inhibited from opportunity. They're allowed to devote themselves to the society as they see fit.
Right.
So which is a positive thing. And then they also use, so then when they are, so quite recently during the there was a, in the 90s, there was a, basically they approached Venezuela to overthrow the Venezuelan dictator, and they basically supported this guy called Chavez. And Chavez was then a coup. He was then detained by the army, thrown it like in a military coup, and Fidel Castro managed to orchestrate it so that Chavez was helped Chavez be released from prison and released from the coup, and then he sent over humanitarian aid to Venezuela, to the people. A lot of them had eye infections, so it meant an eye problems, so they couldn't read, and the doctors that the Cubans provided helped a lot of people within Venezuela. Mm-hmm. This is in comparison to, say, how North Korea looked to gain influence. It's quite different. Mm-hmm. So
you could say
that spies and people who have spied in North Korea have worked out that the North Koreans are making armament and drugs deals with wealthy tycoons internationally for money and or oil. And they'll do this secretly. They might buy an island, a remote island, and then put like a fake hotel on it, and underneath there is a factory for guns and munitions. And they are looking also to then use these munitions to support totalitarian regimes such as Assad's regime in Syria. They were who were allies prior to Israel sanctioning this action. So I think this is quite different. I mean, there is still an ideological motive behind each of these actions, yet the support provided from Cuba is no longer militaristic, but is instead to promote stability and then also provide humanitarian aid, so to better the population of the countries involved. Whereas in Korea, it's to promote fear and violence and dependency with the use of armaments and drugs. Yeah. So what is one more benefit? I mean, personally, I am all for supporting people in need in comparison to keeping people in fear, which is why I'm more lenient to the message that Cuba provides than the message that North Korea secretly believes in.
It's first of all, I would encourage, like you did for me, I would encourage lots of people to watch the BBC iPlayer documentary called The Mole. Gives an incredible amount of insight into even just what North Korea looks like, because it's so shrouded in secrecy, and just the weird rules that they have. You know, pretty much every hotel you go in has bugs and all this stuff. Without wanting to sound xenophobic, I suppose, it is insane how twisted, I would say, a nation North Korea is. At least the government, obviously. The government's MO, the way it basically, like you said, runs its country is just through fear, censorship, shutting down anybody who opposes them, and yeah, all these shady deals that they have going on, selling armaments, not selling armaments, well, yeah, selling armaments, and just, you know, trying to expand their influence. My history teacher used to say about the Cold War, he was like, well, it's easy to say now that they were paranoid, but it isn't paranoia if they really are out to get you. And in a way, I do think that if they had the option, North Korea would probably like to annex the US and the UK and the West as a whole. And you could argue that the opposite is also true. Now, that's very, very unlikely to happen, obviously. But it is worth keeping in mind that these frictions, these very strong, I wouldn't even say, this is the thing I was going to mention earlier. I'm not even sure that it's ideological at this point. You know, I think we're long past the Red Scare, quote unquote. You know, there's not like the idea of communist ideas infiltrating our lovely capitalist utopia. It's no one really thinks like that anymore. Really, this has come down to an international political dispute. There's heavy UN sanctions on North Korea. You know, there's so much tension between the US and North Korea, probably more so than any other country. I would say that North Korea is probably the US's #1 major enemy right now. Obviously not military enemy, but you know what I mean. So yeah, in a way, I almost think it's become a political thing. It's not like we disagree. I mean, we do, I suppose. We disagree with the way they treat their citizens and the censorship and all this stuff. But realistically, I think it's come down to fear. we're afraid of North Korea in some respect, and they're afraid of us. At least that's my opinion. But yeah, I guess to answer your question, I'm not a huge fan of the way they treat their citizens, and I think Cuba, like I said, is almost a much more hopeful way of viewing communism. I guess it's a way that it could potentially work.
Yeah,
maybe.
I mean, Cuba is still not perfect. They do allow some freedoms of expression, such as religious practice, and I think freedom of like yourself, but they do not allow political expression that differs to the state. However, there has been mass upset on previous occasions. Firstly, when Fidel Castro came to power, again in the 1980s and in the 1990s, where there were periods of like famine, and most of these Cubans migrated over to Florida. But Castro didn't stop them. He was like, if you want to go, go. So he did allow, although he didn't allow for self-political expression in his own country, he was not against the freedom of movement, which is something that is really not allowed in North Korea. I mean, if you want to visit North Korea, I mean, I wouldn't particularly advise it, but but if just purely for the example of Otto Warbier, an American student who visited in 2017, he got caught trying to take a political poster from a North Korean hotel and was imprisoned in a punishment camp, and basically came back to the US a vegetable and died quite soon afterwards, after several years of campaigning to get him returned home. So whereas, I mean, the Kardashians have visited Cuba and nothing happened to them. So, you know, this is kind of the difference in the level of tourism.
yeah. Cuba is like is a tourist hotspot, kind of.
This is the difference in the freedoms of movement that we have. I think maybe, I mean, could communism become more democratic potentially? I don't like, could they allow political disagreement within communism, or is that beyond?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's at what point does it cease to be like the whole, because at what point does it cease to be communism, I guess? Because if you
Yeah.
want equality, if that's like, the way I always sort of organized it in my head was like, okay, capitalism, its goal is individualism, basically,
Yeah.
right? So that means like freedom is the main sort of goal. The main goal of communism is the complete opposite. It's equality. It's wanting everyone to be equal. And in a way, allowing for political expression, people to disagree with the government, sort of goes against that MO. Now, I'm not saying that if you have a communist government, that they couldn't make it work, by having different parties and elections, and for example, all this stuff. There's not to say that it couldn't work. It would just, I don't know, in my mind, it doesn't, I can't think of a way for it to fit.
It can just be very left and less left. There would end up being elements of right wing, and then that would more, and that would lead to what we have, a more traditional democracy where there are socialist movements and there are more right wing, more capitalist or even fascist movements, but overall there's a sort of equality of there's yeah
absolutely. And again, I think this comes down to ultimately, like, you can't have one or the other. If you want as a whole to have a sort of functioning and good society, nation, whatever you want to call it, it's you need to have sort of aspects of both. As we've seen, there's not been really, other than I guess Cuba, you could argue, communism has never led to anything other than corruption and dictatorship, censorship, all this stuff. And
they're still present in Cuba. They're just not. They're just not documented as much. I think if you
just
live
less
in
so, I guess.
I mean, there are other, state part, like Singapore it's a one state party. They have great systems, have great opportunities.
Yeah.
Great science hub for research, things like that. But if you go against the party, or you break one of their laws, such as chewing gum, graffitiing, having drugs there, you could die, or you could get beaten by the police, or what.
Yeah, and then the problem is, like, there's nothing. Then what can you do about that? It's have a revolution. I mean, this is all obvious, I guess, but it's something to consider. Like, if you have a one-party system of any kind, then even if you have like the most conscientious people ever running the government, that it just doesn't work, because you'll just end up having stuff that people disagree with, and then they can't do anything about it. Which to me obviously is why you need some form of political representation. But I guess that's getting off topic. But the UK is kind of a good example. I mean, we're obviously more right-wing than left-wing, but we have, compared to America, where we're a lot more left-wing, in the sense that, okay, if you don't have a job, you can, I mean, there's obviously practical issues with this, but supposedly, in theory, if you don't have a job, you can claim benefits. If you are injured, you can go to the hospital for free. There's a lot of communist, I guess, ideologies in the way our country runs that just aren't really present in America. There's no lobbyists. There's no wealthy sort of investors, so far as I know, that sort of invest in the government. As far as I can tell, we have a sort of representative democracy. Again, not that it doesn't have its problems, but that's sort of what I'm getting at, is that you really have to sort of find a balance with the two, or maybe not even a balance. You just have to have one system, but take aspects of the opposite idea. Like
Yeah.
Cuba allows for freedom of movement and is aiming for equality of opportunity. Those are right-wing ideas, but it ultimately still is a communist country.
I mean, unfortunately, the freedom of movement is no longer a thing. So it was allowed, but in 1994, because lots of Cubans were leaving the country, Bill Clinton said, "Look, I've now got thousands of Cubans here, and I've got nowhere to put them, and they were causing riots and such, and they were being and so he says, well, I'll make an agreement with you. Because they said basically if people try and escape and stuff, we're just going to stick them in Guantanamo, which is a military base on Cuba, and obviously the Cuban government didn't like that, so they said, we'll free the people from Guantanamo, they can live in the US, but anyone who now tries to leave Cuba to go to the America, we will send them back. So although Cuba has a policy of freedom of movement, you can't go to America if you're a Cuban, you have to go elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole point with the Berlin Wall. That was to stop people leaving, going from east to west.
Yeah. So it is, there are issues, but but Cuba always makes it very clear it's because there is economic sanctions, and multiple times they have tried to speak to America and extend an olive branch and kind of say, we want to do trade, we want to have a positive relationship with the US. And this was, and like things had started to soften under the Barack Obama presidency, but obviously reverted under Trump. But if the USA could ever release economic sanctions on Cuba, I think their fear is that it will feed the socialist revolution, and it will threaten the US into a state of war. That is what they worry about. But is there a way to, if they were to relinquish economic sanctions, would it be manageable to do so on terms where that maybe the Cubans would promise not to threaten socialism on the USA or something, or threaten violence?
No, that's very true. The economic sanction problem is an interesting one, because obviously, well, it beats military sanction, but it definitely doesn't help international relations, obviously. I would argue that not the reason, but a contributing factor into why the North Korea is so hostile towards the UN and the countries in it is because of the economic sanctions placed on it. Now, I don't want to sound like a flowery hippie here, because realistically, you have to do something. You can't just let North Korea, you can't just let it get away with the shit it does. But I don't know, in a way, you can't really have a functioning you can't really have a functioning relationship between two countries if you're imposing sanctions on it. So really, realistically, you can't. The US is never going to have a good relationship with Cuba unless it undoes its sanctions. Again, I'm not. That doesn't mean to say that if you just lifted it and did nothing else, everything would be fine. I think there is, particularly because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I guess, there is some legitimate cause for concern about just leaving Cuba to its own devices. But realistically, in the modern day, they don't exactly pose much of a threat to the US.
No. Um, I mean, they're a very outspoken nation, and although, and I mean, they have found ways they have found diplomatic means of having their ideals met with even to the point where they involve the papacy, so the Pope, with an exchange of prisoners with the US, political prisoners. So the Pope, they orchestrated it with the Pope and Obama, so that they would say, look, we will give you your political prisoners if you give them ours. But that was very unpopular in the US, so the Pope extended his diplomatic hand via a way of like humanitarian need. So they got what they wanted, but they just did it they did it without threatening to drop a bomb on them, you know?
Yeah.
And so is that necessarily, again, is that if they had greater freedom, how else would they go about it? Would they then go back to guns and violence? I think that very much depends on the dictator, to be honest, and the history of the state. I think Cuba believes greatly in liberation to an extent, or the liberation of all people, instead of with North Korea, although it just seems to me to be like the oppression of all people. So I think, I mean, this is my opinion, maybe somebody who else would put me in my place about this, but I feel that if their message is not violent on an international forum stage, then why impose economic sanctions on them? Maybe just don't highly involve yourself with them.
Maybe just leave them be.
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously a policy, a general policy in international law and international relations. It's non-intervention where possible. As a general rule, you should leave each country to its own devices. You know, even if you disagree with them ideologically or whatever. This is this is a very high concept. I'm sorry. I'm trying to think about what to think, because yeah, I think ultimately the thing to do here, particularly with Cuba, is to sort of let them be, particularly from the US. Obviously the problem then, what do you do about countries? Well, we haven't even mentioned like China, who are almost as bad as North Korea in many ways. You know, what do you do about countries like that?
Well, I think with the issue with China, what makes Cuba and North Korea different is they're quite small countries. They're quite easy. They can be contained by the other superpowers. China is itself a major superpower, and has a titanic army, and has its fingers economically all over the world. It's much harder to deter China without suffering big consequences yourself as a country than it is to pick on smaller countries.
Does have a seat on the Security Council as well?
What, China is part of the UN?
Yeah, they have a seat on the UN Security Council.
I mean, yeah. So they've been in these countries have not. Is Cuba in the UN?
Yeah, I think no. So yeah, I guess I should explain. Yeah, the key members of the UN Security Council. Well, there's a load of members, but there's 5 that are permanent. You just double check. I'm fairly confident what they are, but it's China, US, France, and Russia, and the UK. they're the five permanent members. So basically, this is mainly concerned, obviously, with matters of international disputes. So if there's any sort of international dispute, the China or any of the other five members can veto it, and it just doesn't happen. So obviously, the US and China disagree a lot, and one country might have vested interest in one country and whatever. It basically stops a lot of things from being done internationally. Now, obviously, the alternative is you let one country decide everything, which isn't ideal. But fundamentally, my point is they're a very large stakeholder in international politics.
Yeah. So
the idea of imposing sanctions on them is kind of stupid, because they could just as easily impose sanctions on us.
And it also could be seen as, well, sanctions are the start of the aggression, is like a microaggression that leads to war. And I don't think many countries want to start a war with China.
Not many, nah, I don't think so.
So it's easier to allow China's economic differences to be or political demographic differences to be kind of left alone than a smaller power, which is much easier to be having more aggressive policy towards.
Yeah.
So in the case of North Korea, what was quite intriguing was that Donald Trump really got on very well with the leadership in North Korea. They seem to agree on a lot of things. They seem to have a vested interest, but Donald Trump, I would safely say, is probably one of a kind in American politics.
He's one of the what?
He's a one of a kind in American politics.
Oh yeah.
I don't think there will be another Donald Trump-like figure for a while.
They seem to get on in person. However, there was plenty of examples where there was plenty of examples where they threatened each other, like they like to do, with bombs and intercontinental ballistic missiles and all that stuff.
They do, but there was definitely some, but it was much soft. Like, he changed the conversation to potentially in North Korea to what was very much like a fixed line that the presidency held with North Korea.
Yeah.
He opened up a dialogue, which was not. He's the first US president to ever meet a North Korean leader.
Yeah.
So he definitely changed policies there internationally. So although I don't think policies against North Korea will change for maybe another 200 years, I think
it's a start.
I think policies may soften elsewhere.
Yeah, for sure. I guess you got to give them props for that, at least, just for meeting with them. Yeah, in a strange way, it's people, particularly in the US, are very against creating relationships with Russia and China and all this stuff. I suppose they'd rather see them as the enemy, or maybe they're worried about collusion or corruption. That was obviously a big thing in the 2016 election.
Yeah, each country wants to be self-determined by their own country. They don't want interference with foreign interference, which is slightly ironic considering how much America's done it to the rest of the world. But there we
go. Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's that very much upset the American populace. But I think, I guess, do you think that communism, do you think communism can hold up a line and be treated as or be respected within the international stage, or do you think it will always be sidelined? I guess.
I don't know. I mean, if you talk, it depends. Again, it depends on the what shade of red you're talking here. Because obviously China, as I mentioned, is a very big international player. I think I don't know. From studying the Cold War, it's difficult for me to imagine a situation where communism doesn't result in a USSR type situation if it sort of got to a certain level of not popularity, but influence in the international sphere. That you have people. There's been plenty of examples. I mean, there's like Russia tried to annex Ukraine. There is elements where countries in the East are trying to sort of employ similar tactics to what was used by the Soviet Union. So, in a way, I guess I can't really imagine a scenario where that level of ideological differences doesn't cause problems.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't know. I guess I'm a bit of a pessimist because I really can't see a situation where this ends well. What about you?
So you think there will always be an us versus them scenario?
I think so.
Um,
Yeah. I hate to say it, but yeah.
I think it firstly depends on the kind of leadership there. I think China is still quite a collaborative nation on the whole. Like it wants to involve itself in trade, and it doesn't necessarily. For example, like what's it, the Huawei 5G that's been going bid that's happening in the UK. They're interested in infrastructure. They do a lot of infrastructure builds and things like that. They were heavily involved in rebuilding Vauxhall, which is a region of London that had become very run down in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So there is scope, I think, for collaboration, and I think that it is possible to ignore differences in policy and still get along. But I don't think you're never going to be bosom pals. Like you're never going to have an alliance like we do with the US or France or so on.
Yeah.
But I think it is possible for them to be allowed to have a voice on the international stage.
Yeah. Well, I like your interpretation better because it's more hopeful. Yeah, I guess I would like to think. I'm certainly being pessimistic, but I suppose I would like to hope.
That's about all I have to say. Is there anything else
Yeah.
you'd like?
No, I think that's a good note to end on, I suppose. Hopefully we'll just we'll learn how to get on better with each other, even if we're halfway across the world.
I mean, Woodrow Wilson would love that.
I think most people would love that, honestly. I mean, nobody cares, really, do they? Like not many people. Most people just, if you think about we're talking about this in an international political way, but most people don't want. Well, most people don't want to be in war, but most people just don't really care like what other people halfway across the world are thinking or doing. They're concerned about themselves.
As long as it doesn't involve them and it doesn't
Exactly.
restrict them in ways. I mean, if I was North Korean or Cuban, I would probably be quite hacked off with certain countries. So I think it's kind of depends where we are, but us as a free nation, it doesn't affect us.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like we should try and learn to respect each other, but keep again, that idea of non-intervention, keep the boundaries there, but just improve the diplomatic relations that exist. That would be the ideal scenario.
Yeah.
But yeah. Thank you very much for listening. This is a very interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for
Yeah. Thank
listening.
you.
Bye.